The Seahawks went into this offseason with a ton of question marks at guard, and they're hoping they address them quite a bit in the previous draft, especially on the right side. Who's got the edge in the right guard competition heading into OTAs? Rob Rang and I are going to be diving in here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s, whether you're listening in nearby Boise, Idaho, or in Branson, Missouri. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We're going to be taking a post-draft ranking review, offensive position groups, now that we've seen who they've drafted, the Seahawks, and who they've added as unrestricted or undrafted free agents to this group. We'll be diving into offensive positional rankings, and we got a couple more undrafted rookies that we're going to take a deep dive on, including a Boise State running back entering the mix and a really talented backfield. This episode is brought your way by Monopoly Go. I admit I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on a classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now for free on the App Store or Google Play. Now for your lead story here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Really, since the beginning of free agency back in mid-March, guard has been the biggest question mark for the Seattle Seahawks on their roster. And then Damian Lewis leaves in free agency. Phil Haynes isn't brought back. Even at the center position, Evan Brown leaves for Arizona. So much uncertainty with 3 new starters in the interior. Not a lot of moves made in free agency either to bring in veterans. But with the draft coming last week and then going, we've got rookie minicamp as well. The Seahawks feel like they have a little bit more clarity there. At least there's more optimism, particularly on the right side. And Rob, we're going to be taking a deep dive into some of these competitions throughout OTAs, and it's going to go into training camp. But we have got to start with the right guard position, because I don't know that there is a more compelling roster battle heading into the 2024 season than what we are going to see there, mainly with Christian Haynes, the third-round pick out of UConn, going up against the incumbent, so to speak, Anthony Bradford, who ended up starting 10 games as a rookie for Seattle a year ago.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the most exciting of the competitions, just because of the fact, I think that in this particular positional battle, Corbin, you're talking about 2 quality candidates, and it just feels very evenly matched. Of course, Anthony Bradford was selected in the 4th round 2 years ago. As you mentioned, Christian Haynes, a 3rd round selection this past year. Both are very physically powerful type and aggressive type of football players, at least on college tape. And Christian Haynes appears to be the better pass protector. But at the same time, as you mentioned, Anthony Bradford started 10 games for the Seahawks a year ago. And while he certainly gave up a lot of quarterback pressures and a significant number of hits as well, he only was registered by Pro Football Focus with 1 sack allowed. And so I think that might surprise some people out there. And I know that in the running game, he was Seattle's most physically dominant blocker a year ago. And there are a lot of people in Seattle scouting and coaching staff who believe that Bradford, when he is focused, is the meanest, nastiest SOB on Seattle's offensive line. And so I think that you have to start the conversation with the incumbent, as you characterized him, and then see if Christian Haynes is able to live up to all of his hype and prove that he is as good as I and you and many others anticipate that he will be.
Yeah, and I think that what makes this so intriguing is a lot of the other positional battles we're going to be looking at where rookies are going to be thrust into a competition for snaps. When you're looking at all those positional battles, most of the veterans that these guys are going to be going up against, let's just look at Byron Murphy II, for example. Byron Murphy II is battling for snaps against 3 proven veterans that have been in the league for quite some time. You've got Leonard Williams, you've got Jaron Reed, you've got Dre'Mont Jones. All guys with at least 5 years of experience that have started a ton of games, have production in the NFL. But in this case, you're looking at a player at Anthony Bradford going into year 2. There is some optimism, and I've been able to talk to some people within the organization that he's a player that they feel like is kind of getting left behind here for no reason, just because of the addition of Christian Haynes. And some of it is because of how great of a player Haynes was at the college level. I mean, no offense to Anthony Bradford, but he didn't have 2 All-American selections. He didn't have 1 at LSU. Now, that doesn't mean that this job is automatically going to go to Christian Haynes. Anthony Bradford, we've talked about this since the Seahawks drafted him, Rob, for being a 330-plus pound offensive lineman. He put up some really impressive athletic testing numbers at the combine. Now, that did not always show up on his film at LSU as a one-year starter there. He didn't have near the experience coming into the league that what Christian Haynes does. But at the same time, you've got all these physical tools. You've got the tenacity. And I think when you go back and you look at the games last season, he had most of his lumps early in the year when he was getting his first starts. And I thought he played better late in the season. Were there still some hiccups? Absolutely. But you are talking about a guy that is 330 plus pounds, that can move people off line of scrimmage, has surprisingly agile feet, can move better than you would think for a player that size. And there's enough physical tools there to believe, with adequate coaching and just taking a leap in year 2, that he could be much better in pass protection than what he was, at least from a pressure standpoint, a year ago. That being said, I think we also got to revisit the new contender, the new competitor here at this right guard position in Christian Haynes, because I think you look at the athleticism standpoint, it isn't just the testing numbers on film. As I mentioned with Bradford, even last year, you don't see a guy that moves the way that the athletic testing numbers suggest that he should. With Christian Haynes, that is not the case. You see a guy who is very comfortable moving, whether it's as a pulling guard, getting to the second level on screens or off combo blocks. You can see that lateral quickness and the mobility. It shows up much more consistently on Christian Haynes' film. And we'll see how it translates to the NFL. But the fact that we're talking about a guy that gave up 15 pressures combined his last 2 years at UConn, he is going to have a built-in advantage with that pass protection polish that he's got coming into the league that Anthony Bradford is still trying to develop. And we saw that last year. Now, maybe Bradford does take that big leap this year. I very much expect this is going to be a wide open competition from those two. But it feels like if you're looking for advantages for Bradford, it's that he started 10 games. That really is the big advantage for him, is that he has played in the NFL. He has started in the league. And as for Christian Haynes, he has not. But he is such a polished player and a high IQ football player coming in that you feel like there are some clear advantages for him coming in that shouldn't leave him in a situation where he can't come in immediately and make this at least really interesting. And I'd be remiss not to mention Tremaine Ankrum in this competition as well, because that's where he has played in the NFL, as right guard. Maybe they have him on the left side, but I could see Ankrum, a guy that Seattle signed early in free agency, being another player that throws his helmet in the ring here. I'd be surprised if he wins the job, and yet he's only 26 years old, and this is a guy that won a national championship at Clemson and participated in a couple of college football playoffs. So there's the pedigree, there's the size. If he's able to stay healthy, this could turn into a 3-horse race.
It absolutely could. I mean, Ankrum's a solid football player. He has been a backup for the Rams the last couple of seasons, has been right on the edge of getting into the starting lineup. I know in my travels through their training camp the last couple of summers, he, again, has been one of those guys, has been right on the edge. So I think that is a significant and very warranted that we mention Ankrum. I'm going to focus back in on the rookie here just for a moment. And again, with Christian Haynes, look, his athletic ability, his polish, as you said, and I think correctly, is to me some of the things that definitely give him a real puncher's chance. Since we're going to use the boxing analogy, I think it does give him a puncher's chance to kind of steal this job. I will say this, similar to the way that some head coaches just really have a bugaboo about turnovers. There's going to be some coaches, some offensive line gurus out there who really going to have a problem with penalties. And that is one of the things that I definitely need to make sure that we talk about here with Christian Haynes. He's got 4 penalties each of the past 2 seasons, so 8 over the past 2 seasons when he was an All-American. And where he often gets those penalties is he gets a little bit kind of reckless when he's blocking on the move. His initial quickness, his lateral agility, his just tenacity. He wants to put everybody into the turf. It's what results in so many of those highlight reel blocks that everybody is gushing over. But at the same time, he can get a little bit reckless. If he gets a couple of early penalties in some of these training camp games, in some of the preseason games, or training camp, that's where I think could level the playing field. And again, give the quote unquote veteran in Anthony Bradford or Tremaine Ankrum, as you mentioned, just 26 years old for Ankrum, and Bradford's 24 years old at this point. It gives them, I think, at least a little bit of advantage heading into all of this process. But I do believe ultimately that Christian Haynes is going to wind up being the better player long term.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Where we don't know things stand necessarily without seeing OTAs, we don't know how quickly Haynes is going to be able to jump into that spot. And whether Anthony Bradford, he could have something to say about that. He's still a very young player. Like, hey, I started 10 games last year. Don't forget about me. So I do very much expect this to be an intense competition. I think it's going to be a 2-horse race, but don't count Ankrum out. We shall see when OTAs start later this week how things start to shake out and how the rotations on the offensive line start to bear out as we gear up for training camp and the 2024 season. Up next, we're out of the draft. The Seahawks probably are done with roster moves for the most part, at least the meaningful ones. There's going to be some rotating at the bottom of the roster, but with the draft in the rearview mirror, we are going to be ranking all into that up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by our friends at Monopoly Go. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly. I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You already talked about that, but there is just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock. And there's so much you can get, whether it's unique stickers you can trade with a friend to complete albums for big prizes. There's new playing pieces to travel the boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting your friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. They've got unique mini games like digging for treasure or the robot machine. And there's always new timed events that can help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and download it now for free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. You're listening to the Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. For those of you that are watching live, I think things are going well, but just so everyone knows, I am in Missouri with the family for a mini vacation. And if you've been paying attention to the news, there's been some really nasty storms that went through the area yesterday. So today there's been some issues with power and internet not necessarily working maximum capacity coming off those storms yesterday. So hopefully we will be good to go for the rest of the show, but just a heads up in case there are a few little freezes or anything, probably related to the storms that came through the area yesterday. Luckily, nobody was injured or houses damaged or anything around here in the last 24 hours. Anyway, let's get back to talking football, Robin. We're out of the draft now, and I know there's going to be some shuffling at the bottom of the roster for the Seahawks and everybody else heading towards training camp. OTAs, there's that shuffle. Well, we got to look at this guy. That was enough. Moving on. Time to bring somebody else in. And we're going to see that happen. When guys get banged up, they may bring in another player from that position back in so they have depth. So there's going to be a few roster moves here and there. But for the most part, I would expect that the roster we see right now, it's going to be the 2024 Seattle Seahawks. So keeping that in mind, post-draft, it's time to rank position groups, where things stand. And we'll see how different these rankings look compared to before the draft when we were talking about this. I know I've got a couple switches on my rankings. We've got 7 offensive positional groups. Rob, going to give you the mic here first. Who is at the bottom here? Who is at the bottom of the totem pole on offense for the Seahawks heading into this season?
Well, it's the same position group that I argued was at the bottom of the list a year ago, Corbin, that being center. Olu Oluwatimi obviously was on Seattle's roster 2 years ago. They had the free agent Evan Brown. He basically has been replaced by Nick Harris. I still see this as a position group where Seattle has a quality starter, in my opinion. I think that Oluwatimi is going to be able to come into the NFL and, again, be a quality starter. I think that Nick Harris can start for you in a pinch. I do believe, however, that both of them are center-only type of prospects. That doesn't give Seattle much versatility there. It obviously doesn't give them much starting experience, considering that they have, one game is starting among the two of them. But at the same time, I like the power. I like the intelligence. I just think that this is, at least on paper, the weakest position on Seattle for offense.
Yep, I'm in full agreement here just because there's a lot of uncertainty there. I mean, we've only seen a couple games started by Nick Harris in Cleveland, so he is still a relative unknown from an NFL standpoint. And Oluwatimi's got one NFL start under his belt, only played a handful of snaps last year. So while either one of those players, we expect Oluwatimi's going to be the starter there, but there's not proven tangible on-field production from either one of these guys in the NFL. So that is number 7 for me. I had a different position group at dead last, and now it's 6, and that is the guard position. And we just talked about it. I think bringing in Christian Haynes by default makes this a much more fascinating position group. And then Satawa Lamea as well, a player that started a lot of games in the Pac-12, was a multi-time all-conference selection. So you bring those guys in. Laken Tomlinson was added after our last ranking. So this is still a group that has a lot of question marks. We haven't seen Christian Haynes on an NFL field yet. We don't know what Anthony Bradford looks like in year 2. Can Laken Tomlinson bounce back from the worst statistical season in his NFL career in New York? I mean, there's still plenty of question marks, but for me, those two have flipped. I now have guard at number 6, and I've got tight end at number 5. Just because there's going to be enough questions behind Noah Fant. And heck, Noah Fant, you gave him the big contract, or you get to get more production out of him in Ryan Grubb's offense. They believe that's going to happen, but until it does, you've got some questions. Where does A.J. Barner fit into this mix? Is Jack Westover going to be a player to watch here? What does Farrell Brown do after signing a one-year contract? It's another position group where it feels like after losing Will Dissly and Colby Parkinson, there are some questions short-term and long-term here for the Seahawks.
Yeah, no question about it. And that's basically exactly how I have it as well. Starting off from the bottom again, center, then guard, then tight end. And you basically are taking the words right out of my mouth, sir, in terms of the justification of why we are ranking them there. I'll jump in at the number 4 position group of concern, again, in ascending order, as far as the most talented. So that would be offensive tackle, at least for me. I certainly believe that Charles Cross has Pro Bowl potential. I think that Abraham Lucas is a quality starter. And as we talked about during our coverage of the NFL draft, to me, it was encouraging that Seattle did not prioritize offensive tackle in this draft class. We talked so many times about how good this class was. The fact that Seattle did not use a high selection basically makes me feel that the club feels very good about Abraham Lucas and that surgically repaired knee, about the possibility of bringing back one or both of those players on long-term extensions. Of course, you bring in George Fant, you make the 7th round selection, Mike Jarrell, who has got all the upside in the world. Stone Forsythe played pretty damn well when given his opportunities a year ago. So again, I think that Seattle's tackles are not an elite bunch, but I think that they definitely are good enough that you should be able to win an awful lot of football games.
I'm actually going to have a slight switch from you, and this is one that I've been waffling is guess the best word here, but I'm actually going to put running back at number 4 and tackle at number 3. And here is my justification. I don't think that fans understand. DJ Dallas is obviously a player that's replaceable. He was not a star. He was not a starter, but he was a good special teams guy with third down value. Seattle's got to see, is Kenny McIntosh going to be that guy? I think when you look at Ken Walker III and you look at Zach Charbonnet, these two are both really good NFL running backs that complement each other, and in a scheme that really accentuates their skill sets, this should be one of the better 1-2 punches in the league. But the question is, who's going to be your third down guy? Where does Kenny McIntosh fit in? Are they going to be able to find a 4th running back? They didn't draft one. They signed a few. We'll be talking about one of them here later. But I actually have tackle ahead of the running back group in terms of pure talent, because I still think Charles Cross in year 3 especially with Scott Huff coaching him. I still think there's an incredibly high ceiling there. Abraham Lucas, the latest things that I have heard are all optimism about his knee, getting that surgery earlier in the offseason, for him to come back and get back to the level he played at his rookie year or better. George Fant is a very good, serviceable backup swing tackle. Stone Forsythe has started and improved on the field. And Mike Jarrell has a ton of upside. It does feel like a positional group. Heck, Raekwon O'Neal as well as a guy that they like in that position group. So I feel like depth and talent and maybe importance of the position as well. I actually have tackle with a very slight edge over running back. As far as my top two, this is another one I've been waffling on. Everybody's going to say, well, receiver should easily be number one, but I'm going to go quarterback. And it goes down to positional value and the fact that at receiver, DK Metcalf, obviously under contract through 2025, but Tyler Lockett, what's the future hold beyond this year? He's coming off a somewhat down year by his standards. Jackson Smith and Jigba had a good rookie year, but not great. What's that next step look like for him? We have a little uncertainty there. And there's been some guys who have been injured like D. Eskridge. You're bringing in Laviska Shenault, hoping he can give you something. So I think it's a very good receiver group, but having Geno Smith and a potential heir apparent in Sam Howell, who you got for peanuts, just swapping picks, and he's got 2 years left in his contract that you can evaluate him, and maybe he becomes a guy next year. If Geno plays really well and he doesn't, hey, that's a win for your organization. Geno Smith gets the job done and you win a bunch of games. It doesn't matter. I actually really like the quarterback situation, which is why, based on positional importance, I've got him at number one.
Yeah, I actually have quarterback at number 2. I had wide receiver at 1, running back at number 3. And I think you make some valid arguments for why quarterback should be ranked so high. Again, I have is the second strongest positional group here. Now, I do think that some of our listeners are going to think that we are having this conversation, Corbin, with some very Seahawky blue glasses on. The reality is that Geno Smith's been very good. He hasn't been great, at least not consistently. And Sam Howell, of course, was basically the epitome of mediocre in his one season as a starter for a Washington Commanders team that took a quarterback, traded him out at number 2 overall. So obviously we are talking about some talent, but also some upside with Geno Smith and Sam Howell. I think what it comes down to is that when you evaluate tape the way that you and I do, of course, we see the caliber of difficulty, the throws that Geno Smith and Sam Howell have had to make. How many times, especially with Geno Smith, that he had to kind of duck and dip his way through pressure and be able to throw some balls that were just absolutely exquisite. When you needed throws that had pace, he could throw the ball with velocity, with touch, with accuracy, on the move. He's demonstrated leadership ability as well. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that the Seahawks quarterback are among the best positional groups among quarterbacks in all of the NFL. But to really achieve that number 1 overall status that you gave him, sir, I think that Geno Smith has to lead, or Sam Howell, have to lead the Seahawks deeper into the playoffs. I would argue that wide receiver was the one positional group, of course, on this list the Seahawks did not address in some way over the offseason. I suppose if you want to mention Laviska Shenault, but certainly not the doesn't have the aplomb that, say, a Sam Howell trade does. And so I would argue that wide receiver was Seattle's strongest positional group heading into the draft, and it certainly is so afterwards as well.
On tomorrow's episode, we will have our defensive position rankings, which that one may be a little bit more chalk, or maybe we'll see some more flip-flops as you and I had some significant differences on these rankings today coming out of the draft. We'll get to the defensive ones tomorrow. Up next, we're going to continue our deep dive into Seattle's undrafted rookie class. We've got running back George Holani from Boise State and defensive tackle Buda Jones. He has been the talk of the town in Seattle since the end of rookie minicamp. We'll be diving into both those players up next here on our Tuesday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode of Locked On Seahawks is brought to you by your friends at FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. Do you think Cale Makar has a hat trick coming tonight for the Avalanche in Game 1 against the Stars? Is George Kirby going to strike out 10 or more for the Mariners in his next start? Are you feeling optimistic about another big game for Anthony Edwards and the Timberwolves going up against the Nuggets in Game 3? You can bet on all of it on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You're listening to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Tuesday edition. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to all the 12s tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are going to continue taking a deep dive into all of Seattle's undrafted free agent signings. Yesterday, we had Jack Westover on offense, Carlton Johnson on defense. We're going to continue to split up offense and defense. Going to talk some running backs, especially a Boise State running back today. Looking forward to that. And on defense, a massive human being on the defensive line that went from tryout player to undrafted signee for the Seahawks. And Rob, we're actually going to switch things up a little bit. We're going to start on the defensive side of the football because I know you were glowing about this kid yesterday. We didn't get much of a chance to talk about specifics with him, but Buda Jones, you want to talk about a player who was not on the radar that suddenly is. The things that I have been hearing from people around the team since the conclusion of rookie minicamp. And I can tell you, you watch both these guys, Byron Murphy II, you mentioned this yesterday, you watch him next to Buda Jones. These two guys have very similar builds and both have really powerful lower bodies. Now, again, Buda Jones does not have the numbers or quite frankly, the pedigree, nothing close to Byron Murphy II. And yet I had to go back and get my hands on some film, and I started watching a little bit of it yesterday. And even though this guy had very little pass rushing production, he didn't have any sacks. You go back and you watch the film last year, that doesn't mean he wasn't disruptive. This guy is capable of getting back into the pocket and shrinking it, creating pressure opportunities for others. And he's really solid against the run with that powerful frame, taking on double teams and being able to penetrate when he needs to.
Yeah, Corbin, he looks like a former wrestler. He's 6'1", 307 pounds. He's got stubby arms and he's got incredible power. And he comes off the ball quicker than you expect. He's an interesting guy. As you said, not a single sack in his 3 seasons, at least at Troy. And, he's a nose tackle. And I believe it was 65 tackles over those 3 years. And there's 6.5 tackles for loss or something around that nature. The point is this is a guy who is basically going to be playing in the box. And he is not going to be making tackles outside of the guard box. He's not likely going to be able to create much initial penetration and create his own tackle for loss opportunities, but he can push the center back on his heels and basically create a pile in the running game. And it's remarkable how quick his hands are. He's got short arms, as I mentioned before, but still incredibly powerful. 35 repetitions in the bench press just says all that you need to know about his actual upper body strength. But again, 29.5-inch arms, that's one of the things that you're really going to be concerned about with him. It's the fact that he just is going to be overwhelmed against the bigger, stronger, faster athletes that he is going to face in the NFL. That's why he didn't get a free agent offer initially. But of course, Seattle brought him in. He was obviously impressive enough in their, minicamp, rookie minicamp here to earn that signing. So again, when you watch him on tape, you see flashes of his ability. I'm just eager to see what the Seahawks are able to do with this young man's talent because he does play hard and he does have the physicality that frankly Seattle was missing up and down the line of scrimmage a year ago.
They certainly could use a developmental nose tackle because you expect that Cameron Young's going to still be getting rotation snaps behind Jonathan Hankins, who's a little older player. It'd be nice to have somebody that you can develop in that regard. So this could be a kid that he hangs around. Maybe he has a good training camp and he's on the practice squad. Going to be a really difficult position to break through on. I don't think you can say the same, though, for George Holani, the running back from Boise State. And I kind of hit on this earlier in the show. Reason I had running back at number 4 and not number 3 is behind Ken Walker III and Zach Charbonnet. You and I both love Kenny McIntosh's skill set. We think he can be a really solid player, but he didn't play any offensive snaps last year. He was dealing with a knee injury the first half of the year. When he came back, only dressed for a couple of games. we don't know yet what he can do. He didn't play any preseason games either because of that injury. So he is a relative unknown aside from a few training camp practices early that were impressive. And you don't have DJ Dallas. And whether you were a fan of his game or not, he brought some things to the table that the other running backs in the Seahawks roster don't. He was a really good third down player. So I think there's some question marks. And when you look at George Holani coming out of Boise State, it's funny. I was watching him at rookie minicamp, Rob, and without having Zach Charbonnet on the field, obviously, it was rookie minicamp. He was not there. But if you didn't know any better and you were just looking at the guy's frame, he looks like Zach Charbonnet. And it was something a few of us were mentioning, a few other reporters sideline, that he looks like Charbonnet. If he had a 26 number, I'd think he was out there on the field. And when you watch the tape, there are some similarities in the way that these two play the game and the way they run the football. Now, George Holani is not the same athlete as Zach Charbonnet. He is not going to break away on home run hitting runs near as often. That's not his game. But this is one of those guys that runs with a little bit of reckless abandon between the tackles. He's got solid vision out of the backfield. He's always looking for contact. He can plow forward. He can create yards after contact. And he's also a very underrated receiver. This is a guy that put up some pretty good receiving numbers at Boise State, where they do throw the football a fair amount to their running backs. The running backs are a big part of the offense there in Boise. So if you're looking for a sneaky guy that can really push Kenny McIntosh, I mean, McIntosh was a 7th rounder. George Holani, if he didn't have some injuries in 2 of the last 3 years, I think he easily could have been drafted as a 5th or 6th rounder in this draft. He has that kind of ability, just not the freak athlete that some of these other running backs are, but he's a guy that I like his all-around game. If he can develop more as a pass protector, he was inconsistent in that area. There's some good film. There's some really bad film. If he can get some consistency there and he can play on special teams, this is a kid that's got the mindset to do that. He could very easily make this football team.
He absolutely could. This is a guy that ran 685 attempts in college. He averaged 5.2 yards per carry throughout that time. 5 seasons at Boise State, only one of which that he ran that he was under 5 yards carry. That was 4.8 a couple of years ago. To me, the question is the health. He has struggled with leg injuries, over the last couple of seasons, and that durability is concerning. But at the same time, you mentioned the receiving ability, 88 receptions over his time at Boise State. I was looking at his film again. Pro Football Focus ranked him with 4 pass drops over his career, and I watched those. There was one concerning drop on a wheel route that was a walk-in touchdown if he catches the ball over the top. But it looked like one of those concentration ones. I watched him take a lot of balls when he had defenders in close proximity knocking him off of his feet, and he still hung on. The physicality is, again, something that, as you said in the references to Zach Charbonnet, I mean, this young man will lower his pads at the point of contact, keep his legs driving. He doesn't break as many tackles as I would like, but he's compactly built, 5'11", 206 pounds. He does have good speed, 4.52 seconds in the 40-yard dash. And as I mentioned before, with the receiving ability. So, yeah, I do expect Kenny McIntosh to be the number 3 running back behind Zach Charbonnet, of course, Ken Walker III. But George Holani is a legitimate NFL back. And I do think that he has a chance to make this roster outright or perhaps steal Kenny McIntosh's job.
The Seahawks have their certain style of back, and I think some of that comes down from John Schneider, but Mike McDonald's going to want to get back to that physicality too. So that is a position group I don't necessarily expect to see a new target and the type of player they're going to be looking for. These short, compact, powerful guys that can also catch the football, there's always going to be a place for them in Seattle. So that's another reason that I think George Holani could very easily be in the mix here. And, oh, by the way, you have to have 4 backs that are part of your rotation, and whether it's 3 on active roster, 1 on practice squad. George Holani's got a great chance to have the inside track there, again, as long as he can stay healthy, because that was the biggest bugaboo for him at Boise State. As always, you can follow me on X at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to go over to the defensive side of the football, and we're going to talk some slot corners because Seattle's got a lot of different options in the interior in their cornerback position, and maybe some surprise candidates in there as well. So we'll be talking slot corners, and we'll be ranking defensive position groups coming out of the draft. Make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Go Hawks.